Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Lisa Clark, and I'm the project manager of Scottish Pen, a charity which works to defend writers' freedom of expression and to promote literature. So I'm delighted to be welcoming you along to tonight's Q&A discussion with Tamara Van Stratum, the Executive Director of Take One Action, an Edinburgh-based charity which brings people together through film screenings, conversation and inquiry to inspire lasting change. I'm so pleased that we have an opportunity to discuss the documentary Radio Silence, particularly today as we mark World Press Freedom Day. The documentary includes so many themes of relevance to Scottish Pen's work, from censorship and surveillance to online harassment, defamation threats and outright violence. The story of journalist Carmen Aristegui shines a light on the many threats to press freedom that can be found in Mexico, but also echo around the world. The film opens with footage from a large public protest and many scenes of marches, vigils, and other acts of public expression feature throughout the film. Watching amid the COVID-19 pandemic, I was struck by the realisation that so many forms of free expression, including the human right to public protest, have been stripped from us in the last year. The scenes of Carmen taking her reporting to an online space supported by social media also demonstrated the changing landscape of modern media and the new ways that distant voices can find a platform and an audience. I'm truly excited to hear what our panellists have to say about the film and how issues of press freedom intersect with their own work. Bashabi Fraser is here representing the Scottish Pen Writers at Risk Committee. We also have Nick MacGowan-Lowe from the National Union of Journalists in Scotland. And finally, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Saez Diaz from Pen Chiapas Multicultural, another centre of Pen International. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to tonight's host, Tamara. I hope you enjoy tonight's Q&A and please feel free to visit the Scottish Pen website to find out more about our work to defend writers and to join us in membership. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lisa. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Tamara Van Stratum and I'm the director of Take One Action Film Festivals, a small Scotland-based charity dedicated to nurturing the communal exploration of the stories, ideas and questions at the heart of positive social change. To describe myself, I'm a white woman in her mid-40s with shoulder-length grey hair. I'm standing in front of a white-ish wall. Behind me is a poster of a documentary and a few cacti. As Lisa mentioned, we were keen to celebrate World Press Freedom Day with a discussion inspired by Juliana Fanjul's film Radio Silence, a portrait of Mexican journalist Carmen Aristegui, a film that we screened at Take One Action Film Festival last September on the anniversary of the death of the abduction, I should say, of 43 teaching students in Iguana in Mexico, the 6th anniversary at the time. To date, as far as I understand, only 3 bodies have been recovered, and the collusion between state security and the cartel is heavily suspected in the murder of these students. And the film that you hopefully also opens with a vigil for the murder of a journalist working at local level. Mexico remains one of the most dangerous countries in which to be a journalist. I think it's just below Syria as far as the organization Reporters Without Borders reports. It consistently fails, as you saw in the film, to investigate the murders of journalism. But the film also shows us that freedom of the press can be challenged in many different ways, and the threats to our freedom of expression can be multiform. And I'm really looking forward to us being able to explore this in more detail and in perhaps in different settings, thanks to our guests being based in different countries. So we've got with us a writer, Bashabi. We've got a journalist, Nick MacGowan-Lowe, and then we have a campaigner, Elizabeth, based in the state of Chiapas in Mexico. I just want to mention one quick thing, and that is that we've had to bring in a very, very last minute interpreter to help us for Elizabeth's And this person is very, very kindly stepping in at absolutely no notice. So Diana, thank you very much for being with us tonight. She literally stepped in at 30-second notice. So you might have to give us a little bit of time to allow Diana to translate my questions to Elizabeth and vice versa. And I would like, if possible, to start with Elizabeth for my first question. As I mentioned, the film starts with the murder of a journalist working at a local level. The threats to journalists in Mexico are present in all parts of the country, but specifically for journalists working at local investigations of the cartels. I wondered, for someone working in the states of Chiapas and in the state of Chiapas, defending the rights of journalists within the state, how the film resonated with Elizabeth. Would you be comfortable asking this of her, Diana? Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. Hola Elizabeth, mucho gusto. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Voy a traducir lo que acaba de preguntar Tamara, que es está preguntando que sabiendo que en México especialmente hay muchos ¿cómo se dice? I'm forgetting my Spanish. Que hay muchas amenazas en contra de personas que trabajan con gentes involucradas en los cárteles. Que tú en tu trabajo en específico en Chiapas, que cómo resuena esto contigo, cómo lo relacionas.
En el caso específico de Chiapas, tiene que ver con otras luchas, no tanto con el crimen organizado, que sí tiene resonancia y también está involucrado, pero lo que hemos vivenciado tiene que ver más con la defensa de la tierra y del territorio, con proyectos extractivistas, lo que tiene que ver con la minería. Entonces, el peligro o la lucha de la comunicación tiene que ver más con esta parte, con la defensa de la tierra y el territorio y la libertad de expresión. En el resto del país, de la parte que yo me he documentado, es que sí hay asesinatos o violencia dirigida hacia los comunicadores que sí tienen que ver directamente con el crimen organizado por denunciar pues la impunidad, por denunciar corrupción y entonces se diluye la parte de que si fue un asesinato como ajuste de cuentas, ¿no? Entonces ya no se resuelve, queda impune. Entonces en el resto del país, en el caso de Chiapas, me parece que es distinto, tiene que ver más con otro tipo de proyectos enfocados a la política. De hecho, yo he preparado algo más amplio. No sé si este sea el momento o si no más adelante yo voy a ampliar esta participación.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Voy a traducir eso igual lo que acabas de decir al final y te digo qué me dicen. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was saying that in Chiapas, the fights that people are facing are not as related with organized crime linked with the drug cartels, but mostly related to the defense of land and territory, specifically linked with mining, and that and so the danger is more between that kind of theme and people that are practicing journalism, but that in the rest of the country, the violence is more related. The violence towards people in the media is more related to organized crime and linked with like themes of impunity. And she's also mentioned that she's prepared a bigger contribution and she's asking if now is the time to share that or if it would be better to share it later.
I know that your time may be limited, so maybe if it's okay, we will take her contribution. We will invite her contribution now because it might make things easier for you too, Diana.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, dicen que sí, que si quieres dar tu contribución en este momento, estaría muy bien.
Vale.
If, Elizabeth, if you could just encourage her to stop from time to give you time to translate.
Good idea. No, okay. Y Elizabeth, a lo mejor sí podemos nada más que me digas un cachito y lo traduzco y luego otro cachito y lo traduzco, porque la verdad es que nunca he hecho esto, está difícil.
Bien. Sí.
Gracias.
Bueno, lo que yo pongo aquí, que la situación de comunicadores y periodistas indígenas tienen un doble riesgo debido a su labor periodística y su pertenencia a un grupo indígena. O sea, hay doble, o sea, por comunicar y por ser indígena. En el primer semestre del 2020, el artículo 19 registró 8 ataques contra radios indígenas y 9 agresiones contra periodistas indígenas. Los ataques más comunes son amenazas de muerte, intimidación, hostigamiento, detenciones arbitrarias y bloqueo de información. Esto te lo digo así un pedazo y me dices cuando paro y continúo.
Nada más puedo checar contigo. Me dijiste que fueron 9 agresiones periodísticas.
8 ataques contra radios indígenas y 9 contra periodistas.
Radios y luego me dijiste que fueron por detenciones arbitrarias y...
Ajá. Y bloqueo de la información.
Ok, perfecto. Traduzco eso y ahorita hacemos. Great. So the first part of Elizabeth's contribution is saying that that in Chiapas the situation of communication and journalists is twofold, like the difficulty, because on one side it's just because of the fact is that we're saying that they're communicating, so there is this risk that journalists face inherently in Mexico. But also the other fold is because they are indigenous people communicating this. And already in the first 6 months of 2020, there were 18 attacks to indigenous radio stations, and also 9 journalistic aggressions. Specifically, they were like journalists were arbitrarily detained, and they were blocked in their publishings. Listo, Elizabeth.
Continúo. Un ejemplo es el periodista maya, Ricardo Cárdenas, es de origen maya, se llama Ricardo Cárdenas, quien ha sufrido ataques desde 2017, debido a su cobertura que está enfocada en la corrupción y la política. Entonces, a esta persona lo han detenido, han accedido de manera ilegal a sus cuentas en plataformas sociales y a la página web de su medio. El más reciente se produjo cuando un funcionario público, un político, amenazó con denunciarlo por información falsa. Esto después de que Cárdenas publicó una investigación sobre la entrega discriminatoria de alimentos durante la pandemia.
Ok, muy bien, voy a traducir esa parte. So then Elizabeth just gave a specific example of the Maya journalist Ricardo Cárdenas, who was attacked, who has been a victim of different attacks and threats since 2017. Also, I forgot to mention before that many of these attacks and threats tend to be death threats for the journalists. But so the specifically journalist, Ricardo Cárdenas, he's been attacked because of covering themes around corruption and politics. He has also, people have illegally accessed his social media accounts and his website as well. Public, someone working in the public domain threatened him for an article that he recently wrote on the uneven, discriminatory, and unequal distribution of food during the pandemic. Continuamos, Elizabeth.
Otro caso es que en junio del 2020 desconocidos amenazaron con quemar las instalaciones de una radio indígena, Radio Ayuc 99.1 FM. Este es otro caso de los muchos que hay. Entonces, no sé si continúo o...
Pues si quieres traduzco esa parte y pregunto. ¿Sí? Another example that you just gave is that in June 2020, unknown people set on fire an indigenous radio station, Radio Ayuc FM. And Elizabeth is asking if she should continue or if we should go on with another contribution.
Thank you, Diana, and gracias, Elizabeth. I think I might, what I would like to ask, maybe you can ask Elizabeth now, and she can join us later on once I've had a chance to speak to Bashabi and Nick, is if she could tell us a little bit about the work that PEN Chiapas, the organization she's representing, is doing to further the rights of journalists in the area, and where they're concentrating their powers and their campaigns. That would be my question to her, if that's okay, Diana. And again, thank you. If I may turn to our two other guests, Bashabi, Fraser, and Nick MacGowan-Lowe, which I forgot to introduce properly earlier, but I think Lisa did introduce you briefly. So Nick is an organizer for the Scottish National Union of Journalists, prior to which he spent 21 years as a freelance photographer, beginning his career at the Scotsman newspaper and going on to work for a wide variety of publications throughout the UK. Professor Bashabi Fraser is an award-winning poet, writer, and academic, an honorary fellow at the Centre for South Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She was recently made a CBE for Services to Education, Culture and Integration. And she's an active member of Scottish PEN's Board of Trustees and, as Lisa mentioned, the Writers at Risk Committee, which campaigns for freedom and justice for imprisoned and persecuted writers all over the world. Thank you both for joining us tonight, and thank you, I should have said, to all of you here tonight as well for your patience with us as we got started. Bashabi, if I may turn to you, I really wanted to hear from you as a poet, as a member of the Writers at Risk Committee, how this film resonated with you.
Well, it was a very powerful film, especially as you said, it began with the protest, the public protest, as Lisa mentioned, about justice for Javier, justice for journalists, justice for civilians, and the 43 disappeared student activists, and they were not just talking about the writers and journalists who had disappeared. They were also asking for justice for 22 civilians who had been shot dead, about 16 unarmed farmers. So what Juliana Vanjul has done is she's taken the camera right to the people, and that sort of made it important how Carmen Aristide's voice was so important for them, that she actually was the voice of the people. And so when she bringing the news of what was happening amongst the powerful politicians who were trying to silence everybody and not bringing the right news to people about disappearances, persecution of the freedom of expression. So she actually was rousing a nation from an apathy through her radio station, which was suddenly silenced. And I think radio silence, the very title captures that. I love the way the camera captures Carmen in her daily efforts to get back a radio station, which she herself invests in. And I love her sense of humor when she's setting up her own office with her own investment. And there's this work going on, and she turns around and says, should we silence them? So her sense of humor, her no-nonsense style is very well captured. The fear of her colleagues who are constantly hounded, harassed, followed is also trailed in this film. And I like the way the film moves between the masses and Carmen and her colleagues. And I'd like to quote something that is in the film, and where Octavio Paz says, in all totalitarian regimes, persecution starts against isolated individuals until little by little, everyone is targeted. So Carmen being targeted is everyone being targeted. And that is what the film resonates, that is why it resonates with us. She is the voice of the people. To silence her is to silence the voice of the whole people who need to know the truth.
Thank you, Bashabi. There's a few elements that I might want to pick up on later in what you've just mentioned, especially in terms of the different threats that can befall journalists, and the way that the film also portrays how a woman who is fighting for press freedom has to turn into an entrepreneur in order to carry on exposing the realities of the business world within the country that she lives in. There's a lot of ironies in there, and in terms of how journalists have to turn their own world around in order to shed a light on our world, which I'd like to maybe explore further. And maybe Nick, now's a good time to turn to you as well. I'd like to ask you the same question as someone who's worked as a journalist for so many years. How does a film like this feel when you're watching it from the perspective of a journalist working in a very obviously different context? The threats that journalists face in Scotland are in no way commensurate with what someone like Carmen Aristegui and the many people that Elizabeth has just mentioned have to deal with. But obviously there are other threats to the very principle of press freedom that that affect journalists working here in the UK.
Thank you. Yes, very much. It was an exceptional documentary, and it's difficult to focus on any few points. There was one phrase which caught me out, and I scrambled for my pen so quickly I scared my cat, who ran away because she was sitting on my lap. And it was describing the job of a journalist as bringing to light what lies in shade. Now, there's a lot of shade in Perthshire at the moment, looking out the window, but my goodness, there's a lot of shade in the democracy of Mexico at the moment. And Carmen's role throughout that, and her story, and taking the two layers of her story, and she was utterly unflinching throughout the whole democracy in the refusal to back down in the face of intimidation. And then the second story, explaining the political backdrop in which she has to work. And that political backdrop is the thing that for me makes it difficult to make a bridge, because I work in Scotland, which is a very, very difficult place. So when I look at this, I look at it as a trade unionist. I look at all our issues, and everything we do with members starts on this sort of granular level of talking to journalists on the ground of what's affecting their ability to do their job. We then sort of try to predict as well what happens in the industry. Before the COVID lockdown, we predicted that two things: that the industry, parts of the industry, would be under threat because the financial model was going to fall apart, and also that some organisations were going to curtail press freedoms under the name of COVID, through legislation, through more practical measures. And indeed, the Scottish Government, one of the first things it did was to try and do away with the current time limit on FOI requests, freedom of information requests, on which our journalists so much depend. In truth, Scottish Government's actually one of the worst ones for FOI, answering FOI requests on time in any case. But on a third level, within a trade union, we have at our heart the idea of solidarity, and that solidarity happens not just in our newsrooms here, but nationally and internationally. So, you know, we stand shoulder to shoulder and campaign for journalists in other countries, whether it's Belarus, China, Turkey, India, Myanmar. And it's from that. I mean, the one thing that struck me, I went through the first half of the documentary thinking I knew Carmen. I thought I've met her or I've seen something about her, and it simply wasn't that. It was the personality which was of someone who was determined for where she wanted to be and what she wanted to achieve, and was steadfast in that aim. And it reminded me so much of other journalists I work with in Scotland who have the view, one of them told me, you know, you're taking flack if you're over the target, you know. But that FLAC is in Scotland, as I said, it's not comparable to Mexico, and it's a very difficult leap to make linguistically going into this. But for anyone who's in the National Union of Journalists, we know the background of the context, and that is that our colleagues do get killed. At our delegate meeting every year, or every 2 years now, we remember Martin O'Hagan, who was shot dead in Northern Ireland, walking back from his office one night. Previously, he'd been kidnapped by paramilitaries, I think, or organised crime. 12 years before. He is someone who lived under the threat of what he did. Before him, there was Veronica Guerin. In Scotland, we've had Russell Finley, the investigative reporter who had acid thrown in his face on his doorstep. Now, the perpetrator of that crime has been caught and sentenced, but there's still no indication of who was the person who ordered that, who Russell believes he knows, but there's no indication that we want to go further up the tree to find out who wanted to intimidate the journalist. Lyra McKee, who's now, we're coming to the 2nd anniversary of being shot. And then even more recently, The Digger, which is a quite unusual publication in Scotland, which looks into organised crime. The editor, James Cruikshank, had his car firebombed maybe about 6 months ago. His delivery drivers have previously been threatened, and their retailers have also been threatened by criminals who would rather not have light shed into what they do. So those are the dramatic events that we do. Against that, we've got a much smaller picture. Now, we work nationally. We work with the National Committee of the Safety of Journalists, and our General Secretary sits on that. But when we surveyed, we found 96% of our members thinks that the abuse and harassment that journalists get in the UK and Ireland risks silencing journalists over here. 9 out of 10 say their employers aren't doing enough. And we have to remember that 1/3 of journalists are freelance. They don't have the protection of an employer. As it is, 78% of them see that abuse and harassment is part of the job. And half have experienced online abuse in the last year. Now, this is the context that we live in. And I don't believe that any person tweeting abuse at a journalist on Twitter, and it will be happening right now, will be thinking of the context of Martin O'Hagan or Lyra McKee or any of the other threats to journalism. But it feeds back into the same culture which oppresses and divides and stops journalists doing our job and telling the stories that our communities need.
Thank you, Nick. And I would like to go back to Elizabeth, just because I know she has more to share with us, but I would love to pick up on the threats that people face wherever they operate as journalists, not just in Mexico and in really dangerous places like Syria, which I've mentioned earlier, but in every country where we sometimes tend to, I don't know, rest on our laurels, thinking that freedom of the press is a right that we've acquired and that we'll always keep. I'd like to look at the mental health. Sorry, my son's just walked into the room and is distracting me. Please, you have to go, my sweet. Sorry. Sorry, the realities of working from home in 2021. Yeah, the mental health toll that is these journalists have to face, and the fact that there's a lot of self-censorship that comes in many different shapes and from many different quarters. But the fact that I think one of the things that the film did really well for me was to show that the mechanisms of censorship are manifold. We see issues around editorial control, we see issues around corporate power, official pressure, but also what's referred to sometimes as prior restraint, which is another way of referring to self-censorship. And I know that there's many causes to that self-censorship for journalists these days, but it's something that maybe we could look at. So those two issues of the mental health toll of operating in precarious situations with very little support and very little sense of the long-term longevity of the industry in which you work in the absence of an employer, and then this notion of self-censorship are two things that I'd really like us to come back to, if I can leave that with you, Nick and Bashabi. But in the meantime, if we could go back to Elizabeth, Diana, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, so we'll go back to that first question that you asked, right? Elizabeth, ¿quieren ver si puedes a la pregunta que te puse en el chat? ¿Sí la pudiste ver? Estás en mute. No te escuchamos, Elizabeth. Tienes el micrófono silenciado.
Sí, leí la pregunta que me hiciste. Pues como PEN Chiapas, como Centro PEN Chiapas Multicultural es de reciente creación. Uno de los primeros eventos que se realizó como Centro PEN Chiapas Multicultural fue un encuentro en noviembre, a inicios de noviembre del 2020, un evento que se llamó Periodistas y Comunicadores Indígenas, Voces desde el Chulel. El Chulel es el alma o el espíritu que se podría conocer. Y entonces, en este evento que se realizó como Centro PEN, se discutió o se dialogó acerca pues de los peligros, de las dificultades que tienen como comunicadores, y sobre todo los comunicadores que están como en la parte autónoma, la parte de las radios comunitarias indígenas, y la necesidad de comunicarnos en nuestras propias lenguas originarias de nuestros pueblos, como esta mayor posibilidad de poder conversar y poder dialogar desde nuestra palabra. Eso fue lo que se hizo. Después de esto, se han acercado algunos compañeros periodistas para querer integrarse al grupo. Todavía se están gestando o se están generando proyectos que van a incorporar estas situaciones de defensa o que tengan la palabra los periodistas y comunicadores de Chiapas. Pero sí, ya hemos realizado un evento y sí se tiene contemplado como Centro PEN. Como somos de reciente creación, aún reconocemos que nos falta incorporar mucho más. Entonces también estamos viendo todo lo que es la parte lingüística y la parte de tener esta parte de la defensoría. Eso es lo que se puede hacer, lo que les puedo hacer.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth just shared with us that the Multicultural PEN Center opened relatively recently. One of their first events was to have an encounter in November 2020, where different journalists and communicators, indigenous journalists and communicators, came together, and the event was called Indigenous Journalist Voices from the Chulel, which is a Maya word that refers to the spirit or the soul. And so it was an event where the dialogue was about talking about the dangers and the difficulties that journalists face, focusing on autonomy and on the indigenous community radio stations. And specifically, they are quite focused on language and on how to be able for all of these journalists to communicate in their original language. After this event, many different journalists from the region started coming and becoming involved with this organization. And they are beginning to generate different projects for the defense of the rights of journalists. And however, since they are quite recently created, they recognize that there's still a lot of work to do, but that they are very much focused on this linguistic aspect and the importance of having all the different languages present.
Gracias, Elizabeth. And on that front, if I could just ask one more question, and then hopefully I will free you both from the toil that I'm putting you under. But could you ask Elizabeth what is the most important thing she expects from the international community of journalists specifically? Like, what's the best way, not just for journalists actually, but for civil society at an international level to support her? But again, I'll give you a bit of time if you want to type that in, and then I will turn to Bashabi and Nick while you ask that question, Elizabeth, if that's okay. Thank you. Bashabi, this is a good point at which to bring you, and specifically in your work for writers at risk. I mentioned the notion of self-censorship earlier, and I was applying it specifically to journalists, but I know it's something that can also affect writers, obviously. And I wondered, in your work, how do you navigate those waters when you support writers at an international level, the notion of self-censorship specifically?
Well, Scottish Pen, Writers at Risk Committee is part of Scottish Pen. We're a small body, but I think we are quite effective locally and internationally as we support and campaign for imprisoned and persecuted writers across the world. So though we don't have any writers and journalists in jail in Scotland, we still, thankfully, well, not yet, and I hope never. And we do. We feel strongly about freedom of expression across the world, and you mentioned self-censorship and social media. I think many of our writers do come to us when they feel that they are threatened, harassed for various reasons, depending on their gender, what they write about, and they have been threatened with no platforming, and that actually cuts into the income of a writer. And just as Nick was saying earlier, that when you a lot of journalists are freelance, a lot of writers struggle financially, and yet they need that free space to write in and to be accepted. One thing that Scottish Pen did very recently, and Writers at Risk was very much, with it, was that we were part of the whole debate of the defamation and malicious publications bill, and there was a survey that Scottish Pen was part of with Strathclyde University, asking how writers felt threatened, and that actually, I think, that debate informed the bill, and it was passed on the 2nd of March 2021. So we do feel that we have been part of a national debate and government policy. Another thing I would like to mention is that the Writers at Risk Committee also works with the Rapid Action Network. So any writer who's threatened with arrest, imprisonment, or has been sentenced, we get the information, we pass it out to our members, and people immediately write to their embassies and to the embassies of the writer at risk, threatened with imprisonment or incarceration is concerned. So we campaign for them, and recently we campaigned for Varavara Rao, who had been imprisoned in India, and Scottish Pen actually led the campaign for his freedom, and supported by other pen centers, including International and English Pen and Irish Pen and other pen centers. And I'm just glad to say that Varavara Rao was released on bail. None of the trumped up charges have been dropped yet, but he did have COVID-19 and he was left without care. So we do things like that. The other one I wanted to mention is Christina Toff, whom Scottish Pen has been supporting, who's a Hungarian writer. This is through the Edwin Morgan Trust, Edward Morgan Trust, and that is she has been harassed for for raising concerns about the perception and presentation of women characters in fiction, and she has been a very good with Scottish Pen in that she has provided translation of Hungarian work. And that is what Writers at Risk benefits from a lot. And one other case I would like to mention is we have a Writers in Exile committee as well. And that is where writers in exile who are residents in Scotland are lent a platform. And for example, Ghazi Hussain was supported by Scottish Pen in the Big Lit Festival to read from the work. And recently, we have also, who's a Syrian writer. So we have also another example of a writer after the Black Lives Matter movement. We have a whole campaign to amplify Black voices, and Scottish Pen has been doing that, and Writers at Risk supports this, especially writers who are at risk in various countries across the world who need to be heard. So that is part of the work we do, and we work right across the world. I just want to mention just one more writer, which we feel quite, whom we feel quite proud about. Scottish Pen actually led the campaign against She, who was a writer in China who had been imprisoned, and he was freed with the campaigning, She Turns. So we have been successful sometimes, but not always. But we do also share good news when writers are freed. And that is something that writers in prison and Writers at Risk, the Writers at Risk Committee shares with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Bashabi. It's great to hear that that international pressure can yield results. Nick, I'm gonna come back to you just on that question of kind of the mental health of journalists, and I wondered if you could, if it is the case that National Union of Journalists advocates on that basis, if you could speak a little bit to that subject.
Absolutely. I mean, it's part of a culture. I mean, it feeds into the idea of self-censorship, which I think happens at two levels. It happens on the level of the individual journalist, and it happens almost at an industry level as well. But the pressures on our members are absolutely immense from a number of directions. Sort of increasing job insecurity. We have publishing groups that we work with who we know that at a certain time of year in the run up to Christmas, they'll do a round of redundancies, and the newsroom lives in that sort of culture. We have an increasing culture where journalists' performance is click-led. As in the stories that get the most clicks are seen as the most valuable. Now, you know, much of the most valuable reporting that is done by journalists, you know, particularly on crime in Glasgow, is not necessarily the stuff that gets the big hits. A celebrity holding a hedgehog might trump that several times over, and that in itself shifts the power of what journalists can do and what they're expected to do, and
what they can be funded to investigate as well.
Exactly right. I mean, requesting an investigative journalist and being able to say to an editor, I need a long time to work on this, and there is no guarantee of results at the end of it. And also, you often have to say to an editor, we're not quite there with this story, but we need to float what we know and see if it flushes out and people come forward and are then willing to speak with that. Now, there's never been a time when that has been an easy decision for an editor, but especially so now with the pressures that we're facing in print journalism, with jobs being cut and more work being put onto our members. It makes it less likely for that to happen.
Thank you, Nick. Can I ask, because we've got very little time left now, and I would like to, not in a glib way, because I know we called Take One Action, but we're definitely not reducing people's agency to just taking one action. But what is it that people can do to support independent journalists? If you had 1 minute to tell us what people can do in Scotland to ensure that we retain a free, independent and incisive press, what would it be?
the single thing to bear in mind is the importance of how journalism informs us about the world in which we live, the local democracy, and how the decisions that are made affect our lives and holding those people accountable. If we start from that as the starting point and begin to do that, our media will hopefully reshape around us. But it's simply not to overlook the vital point that journalism plays in a free society.
Thank you, Nick. And I'd like to go back to Elizabeth now, Diana.
Listo, Elizabeth. ¿Viste la pregunta que te mandé? No te escuchamos, está silenciado tu micro.
A ver, la pregunta se refería a... que no, la perdí.
Es que te mandé muchas cosas. Era la de que qué tipo de apoyo necesitaría su organización del Grupo Internacional de Periodistas.
Ah, sí. Sí, ya. Bueno, pues la organización internacional, el apoyo que se requiere es que se pueda promover la libertad de expresión y señalar pues la impunidad en que han quedado los crímenes contra periodistas. El año pasado, organizaciones internacionales visitaron al gobierno mexicano para señalarle los compromisos incumplidos en materia de libertad de expresión, porque aumentó en los últimos años la agresión a periodistas. Entonces, estos organismos lo que hicieron fue señalar el discurso estigmatizante que tiene el gobierno mexicano hacia los periodistas y que ha hecho un compromiso de respetar la libertad de expresión. Sin embargo, en las conferencias matutinas que realiza el presidente, publicó un reporte en donde etiquetó a la prensa como adversarios, basados en que si cubren de manera positiva o negativa la labor del presidente. Entonces, lo que se ha generado es una mayor polarización y denostación de la labor de la prensa, y también sirve como una forma de intimidación a esta labor. Entonces, ¿de qué manera o qué se pediría que se pueda hacer como a nivel internacional? Es seguir realizando el llamado a cumplir con el compromiso de no estigmatizar a la prensa, porque se ha estancado también la impunidad hacia los delitos cometidos contra los periodistas. Muchos no han sido aclarados, no han sido aclarados. Entonces esto es lo que se espera, y también los organismos internacionales, que se podría hacer en este caso al las voces de que los periodistas tengan mayores garantías y los medios de comunicación. Entonces, al hablar, al asistir la voz silenciada toma mayor presencia. Entonces, es justamente eso, que se puedan otorgar garantías a periodistas y medios de comunicación, y también en estos tiempos de pandemia por el COVID-19, también se ha documentado que han muerto 32 periodistas en México a causa del virus, y han habido 73 ataques contra periodistas porque cubrían asuntos relacionados a la contingencia sanitaria, y ni siquiera el gobierno ni las instituciones para las que muchos de ellos trabajan han cumplido con la protección de periodistas. Entonces, en resumen, es que hay más estigmatización y debilitamiento de las instituciones, y también muchos de ellos perdieron sus trabajos. La precarización laboral se agravó con la pandemia. Eso es lo que yo puedo.
Yes.
So Elizabeth is saying that the kind of support that they would need from international voices is to keep promoting the freedom of expression and signaling the impunity of the crimes that have been committed against journalists in Mexico. Even just saying that last year there was this happened, that international organizations were signaling this, but that even within that, since then, there has been a polarization between journalists, which has been fueled partly because of our president's morning meetings. Every morning he gives a press conference of 30 minutes that everyone can tune into. And so, but however, in these conferences, he labeled the journalists as adversaries. And this led to just generated a lot more polarization between them. So just to sum up, what they would ask the international community is just to keep signaling this impunity, and just to keep joining themselves with the demands for the guarantees, the rights of journalists with them.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Diana. I would like to carry on asking more questions, but realistically, we told you we'd be with you until 9:15. It's now almost 9:05. I think I'm going to have to bring this to a close reluctantly. And I wanted to just bring up a quote from a Scottish journalist, or actually a Scotland-based journalist. Sean Bell wrote earlier this year when talking about the defamation bill, actually, that in order to care about journalism, one must care about journalists. It might be an obvious quote, but it's not that obvious. And he said that care must be demonstrated through advocacy, organization, and a clear articulation of what will and will not be tolerated. And I think that Carmen Aristegui's story acts both as a warning and a beacon of hope in that respect. And I leave you tonight with an exhortation to embrace optimism as a moral obligation, as Carmen invites us to. I'd like to thank our guests, Nick MacGowan-Lowe, Professor Bashabi Fraser, Elizabeth Sanz-Diaz, and our interpreter, Diana Garduño Jimenez. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you to Scottish Pen for giving us this opportunity tonight. Please do continue to support independent journalism in Scotland and beyond, and to support independent documentaries. Thank you very much. Good evening.